The moving truck was already gone by the time the neighbors came out to watch. That's what I remember most. Not the eviction notice taped to my door. Not the sheriff's deputy standing there with his hands folded like he was at a funeral. What I remember is the laughter. Sharp, cruel, carrying across the cul-de-sac like it belonged there. Marcus Whitfield stood on his porch with the coffee mug in his hand, shaking his head at his wife, and I heard him say, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "Guess that's what happens when you reach above your station." His wife laughed. Their teenage son laughed. And I stood on the sidewalk in front of the house I had poured 7 years of my life into, holding a cardboard box with my daughter's baby photos. And I said nothing. I just got in my car and drove away, because dignity was the only thing they hadn't managed to take from me yet. My name is Elena Cortez, and that morning in September was the lowest point of my life. But it was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of one nobody in that neighborhood ever expected. Years later, the same family that laughed at me on that sidewalk would stand at my door, hats in their hands, asking for something only I could give them. And what I decided to do about it would change everything, for all of us. If you love stories about people who got back up after life knocked them down, you're in exactly the right place. Because this is Legacy Whisper. And this story is one you won't forget. But let me back up. Because you need to understand how I got there. And why what happened next mattered so much. I grew up poor in a way that people who haven't lived it can't fully picture. Not poor like skipping vacations. Poor like watching my mother stretch a single rotisserie chicken across for dinners. Poor like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small because new ones weren't in the budget. My father left when I was 9, and my mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. I promised myself, somewhere around 13 years old, standing in a laundromat, folding other people's clothes, because my mom cleaned houses on the side, that I would build something solid one day, something no one could take from me. I worked my way through community college, then a state university, waiting tables at night and doing homework in the break room during slow shifts. I met my husband, David, in my last year of school. He was steady and kind, an electrician with calloused hands, and a laugh that made hard days feel lighter. We got married in a backyard with folding chairs and store-bought flowers. And we promised each other that whatever we built, we'd build it together. We saved for 6 years before we could afford a down payment on a house in Maple Hollow, a quiet subdivision with manicured lawns and a homeowners association that took itself very seriously. It wasn't the biggest house on the street, but it was ours. 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, a kitchen where I could finally cook real meals, instead of reheating leftovers between shifts. Our daughter, Sophia, was 5 when we moved in. I remember carrying her over the threshold like it was a fairy tale, spinning her around while David laughed at both of us. I want you to understand something before I go further. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, if you've ever poured everything you had into something only to watch it slip away, stay with me. Because what happens later matters more than you think. And if this story moves you even a little, hit that subscribe button now. Because Legacy Whisper has more stories like this one. Stories about people who got knocked down and found their way back up in ways nobody saw coming. The trouble started 2 years after we moved in. David was on a job site, working on wiring for a new commercial building downtown, when a support beam gave way. He fell 14 feet. He survived, but barely, and the injuries meant months of surgeries, therapy, and a recovery that stretched on longer than any doctor predicted. His employer's insurance covered a fraction of it. The rest came out of savings that were supposed to be for Sophia's college fund, for our retirement, for the life we thought we were building. I picked up more hours at the accounting firm where I worked. I took freelance bookkeeping jobs on the side. I sold jewelry that had been my grandmother's, jewelry I swore I would never part with. Still, the medical bills kept coming, relentless, like waves that never stopped crashing. Within a year, we had fallen behind on the mortgage. I called the bank, begging for a modification, a grace period, anything. They offered forbearance for 3 months. 3 months was not enough. That's when the Whitfield started circling. Marcus Whitfield was the head of our homeowners association, a man who wore his authority like a crown. He'd been born to. His family had lived in Maple Hollow since it was first developed, and he treated the neighborhood like his personal kingdom. When word got around that we were struggling, he didn't offer help. He offered judgment. At the next HOA meeting, he brought up our unmowed lawn in front of the entire room, as if he didn't know exactly why the grass had gotten away from us while I was working 80-hour weeks and caring for a husband who could barely walk. He smiled while he did it. That was the worst part. He smiled. His wife, Deborah, stopped waving when she saw me in the driveway. Their son, Trevor, made comments to Sophia at the bus stop about her broke family, comments that made my 7-year-old come home in tears asking me why the Whitfields didn't like us anymore. I told her some people just aren't kind, sweetheart, and that being kind ourselves mattered more than anything they said. But inside, I was breaking. The foreclosure notice came on a Tuesday. I remember because it was the same day David finally returned to light-duty work. A small victory we'd been waiting over a year for, and the notice arrived like a slap, right after we'd allowed ourselves a moment of hope. We fought it. We hired a lawyer we couldn't afford, filed for every assistance program that existed, wrote letters, made calls, sat in offices explaining our situation to people who nodded sympathetically and did nothing. 6 months later, the sheriff was at our door, and Marcus Whitfield was on his porch, laughing. We moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town, the kind with thin walls and a parking lot instead of a yard. David's recovery continued slowly. I took a second job on top of my first. Sophia adjusted the way children do resiliently, though I saw the way she looked at kids from Maple Hollow when we occasionally crossed paths at the grocery store. A mixture of hurt and quiet pride that broke my heart every single time. I could have let that be the end of the story. Many people do. The system grinds people down, and sometimes there's no getting back up. But something happened during those hard years that I didn't expect. I discovered I was good at something the world actually needed. While rebuilding our finances from nothing, I had taught myself everything about small business accounting, about tax strategy, about helping people navigate exactly the kind of financial disaster that had swallowed us whole. I started helping other people in similar situations, first for free, then for small fees. Then, as word spread, as an actual growing practice, I understood their fear because I had lived it. I understood the shame of a foreclosure notice, the humiliation of neighbors watching your life fall apart, and that understanding made me better at my job than any degree could have. By the 3rd year in that cramped apartment, my client list had grown enough that I opened a small office. By the 5th year, I had 3 employees. David's health stabilized, and he came on board to manage operations, his steady hands, finally free from a job that had nearly killed him, but suited perfectly to the business we were building together. We didn't get rich overnight. There was no lottery ticket, no inheritance, no shortcut. It was 5 years of 18-hour days, of Sophia doing homework in the corner of my office because we couldn't afford a babysitter, of David and I falling asleep some nights still in our work clothes because we were too exhausted to change. But slowly, methodically, we built something real, something that couldn't be foreclosed on because it lived in our expertise, in our reputation, in the trust of hundreds of clients who told their friends about the accountant who actually understood what it felt like to lose everything. By year 7, we had saved enough to buy a house again. Not just any house. I want to tell you about the day I saw the listing, because even now it feels like something out of a story too strange to be real. The listing was for a beautiful colonial-style home in a neighborhood called Ashford Ridge, 20 minutes from Maple Hollow, in a school district even better than the one we'd left behind. But that's not what stopped my breath when I opened the email from my realtor. It was the interior photos. The kitchen with the marble countertops. The built-in bookshelves in the study. I recognized them instantly, because I had stood in that exact kitchen years earlier, at a neighborhood barbecue, before everything fell apart, admiring it while Deborah Whitfield gave me a tour, and made sure to mention how much it had cost. It was their house. The Whitfields were selling. I didn't say anything to David at first. I just stared at the screen, feeling something complicated stir in my chest, something between disbelief and a grim, quiet satisfaction I wasn't proud of, but couldn't deny either. I asked our realtor to find out more carefully, without revealing who was asking. What she told me explained everything. Marcus Whitfield's construction supply business, the one that had funded that beautiful house, and his sense of superiority over an entire neighborhood, had collapsed during a downturn 2 years earlier. He had overextended on loans, made risky bets on commercial contracts that fell through, and quietly bled the family's savings dry, trying to keep the business alive. They'd been selling off assets one by one. The house was the last thing left. My realtor mentioned, almost as an aside, that the sellers seemed eager to close quickly and quietly embarrassed, she guessed, about people finding out. I sat with that information for 3 days before I told David. When I finally did, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked me the question I'd been asking myself. Do you want to buy the house that used to be theirs, Elena? Really think about it. Is that healing? Or is that revenge? It was a fair question, and I didn't have an easy answer. Part of me wanted to walk through that door as the new owner, to stand in that kitchen with the marble countertops as a woman who had rebuilt everything from nothing, while the family who mocked my collapse packed their own boxes into a truck. There is a kind of poetic justice in that image that I won't pretend didn't appeal to something raw and wounded inside me, but I didn't buy that house. We found a different one, in the same neighborhood, actually, 3 streets over, a beautiful place with a yard big enough for the garden I always wanted. I made that choice deliberately. I didn't want my new life to be built on the foundation of their downfall. I wanted it to stand on its own, built from what David and I had earned, not from proximity to someone else's ruin. We moved in on a bright October morning, almost exactly 7 years after the day the sheriff came to our old address. Sophia was 14 now, tall and confident, carrying boxes into her new room with a kind of quiet joy that made every hard year worth it. I stood in the driveway and let myself cry, finally, for the first time in years. Tears that were equal parts grief for everything we'd lost and gratitude for everything we'd clawed back. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you've made it this far, you already know the story isn't really about a house. It's about what happens when people who write you off discover you were never actually finished. If that resonates with you, drop a comment below and tell me about a time you proved someone wrong, because I read every single one, and your stories are what keep this channel alive. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because the twist in this story is coming, and you won't want to miss where it goes. Word travels fast in small communities, even once 20 minutes apart. Within a few months of moving to Ashford Ridge, I started hearing pieces of the Whitfield story secondhand, the way you do at grocery stores and school pickup lines. Marcus had taken a sales job, a steep fall from running his own business. Deborah was working retail. Trevor, once the golden boy of Maple Hollow, had dropped out of the state university he'd been so proud to attend because they could no longer afford the tuition, even with loans. The family that once treated struggle as something that happened to other, lesser people, was now living it themselves, in a rental apartment not unlike the one we'd once called home. I would be lying if I said I didn't feel something when I heard those updates. A small, uncharitable flicker of satisfaction that I'm not proud of, but won't pretend didn't exist. Karma, some people might call it. I tried not to dwell on it. I had a business to run, a family to raise, a life to keep building. The Whitfields' choices and consequences were their own. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening in late November, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, expecting a delivery, maybe a neighbor. Instead, Marcus Whitfield stood on my porch, soaked from the rain, looking nothing like the man who had smiled at my ruin 7 years earlier. He had aged more than the years accounted for. His shoulders were rounded in a way that spoke of exhaustion that went deeper than a bad week. Behind him, half hidden under the porch light, stood Deborah, and I almost didn't recognize her, either. Elena, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on my name. I know I have no right to ask you anything, but I didn't know where else to go. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still on the door, memories crashing over me in a wave I hadn't prepared for. The laughter on the sidewalk, The comments to my daughter at the bus stop. The long complaint read aloud in front of the entire HOA. 7 years of humiliation compressed into a single, silent second, while rain dripped off this broken man's coat onto my welcome mat. Our daughter, Ashley, is sick, he continued, his composure cracking further. It's her kidneys. She needs a transplant, and the medical bills, we can't. Insurance won't cover enough. And I heard, someone told me you help people, financially, with exactly this kind of thing. I know how this looks. I know what I did. I'm asking anyway, because I don't know what else to do. I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that moment, because a sanitized version wouldn't do the story justice. Part of me, a small, human, wounded part, wanted to close the door, wanted to say, "El, you know exactly how it felt," and walk away with the same cruelty he'd shown me on my worst day. I would have understood myself if I had done that. Nobody would have blamed me, but I thought about Sophia, who had been an innocent child caught in Trevor's cruelty at the bus stop. The same way this daughter, Ashley, whom I had never even met, was an innocent child caught in whatever storm her father's arrogance and financial collapse had created. Suffering doesn't discriminate based on who deserves it. And I thought about my mother, who, despite years of poverty, had taught me that the measure of your character isn't how you treat people who can help you, but how you treat people who have no power over you at all. Marcus Whitfield had failed that test spectacularly 7 years ago. I did not intend to fail it now. Come in, I said. Both of you. You're soaked, and this isn't a conversation to have on a porch. What followed was one of the strangest evenings of my life. I sat across from the family that had laughed at my collapse, listening to Marcus explain his business failure in halting, humiliated sentences, listening to Deborah cry quietly about a daughter fighting for her life, while they had exhausted every option they could think of. I didn't offer comfort right away. I let them sit with the discomfort of having to ask, because some part of healing, for me, meant not rushing to make their guilt disappear too easily. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Why did you come to me, specifically? You could have gone to a bank, a charity, 100 other places. Deborah answered, this time, her voice barely above a whisper. Because everyone we know has turned away already. Because you're the only person we've ever heard of who actually understands what it's like to lose everything and rebuild. Anyway. And because, she paused, wiping her eyes. Because some small, ashamed part of me hoped that if you did help us, it would mean we hadn't destroyed something in you the way our behavior deserved to. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I told them what I could actually do. I wasn't a charity, and I wasn't going to hand them a check out of guilt or spectacle. But I did know, through years of building my practice, exactly which financial assistance programs existed for exactly this kind of medical crisis. Programs most people never find because the system is designed to be confusing and exhausting to navigate. I spent the next several hours, that very night, walking them through paperwork, making calls to contacts I had built over years of helping people in crisis, connecting them with a hospital financial counselor I trusted, and a nonprofit that specifically funded transplant-related costs for families who fell through insurance gaps. It wasn't a magic solution. It didn't erase 7 years of humiliation, and it didn't need to. But within 6 weeks, Ashley Whitfield had her surgery, funded through a combination of programs I had helped her parents access, resources that had been available the entire time, but invisible to people who didn't know how to look for them. I visited her once during recovery, a scared, brave 15-year-old who had no idea her father had ever wronged anyone, who simply thanked me with the kind of raw gratitude that made every complicated feeling carried into that hospital room worth setting aside. Marcus Whitfield came to my office 3 months later, unannounced, and asked if he could speak with me for a moment. I expected another request. Instead, he apologized. Not the vague, deflecting kind of apology people give when they want forgiveness handed to them immediately. A real one. He told me he had thought about that morning on the sidewalk more times than he could count over the past 7 years, especially after his own collapse taught him exactly how thin the line was between comfortable and desperate. He said watching his own family struggle had shown him, in a way nothing else could have. How cruel he had been to a woman fighting for her family's survival, and that the version of himself who laughed that day was someone he no longer recognized and deeply regretted having been. I didn't tell him. It was fine. It wasn't fine, and pretending otherwise would have cheapened both his apology and my own pain. But I told him I accepted it, and that I believed people could change, because I had watched him change in front of me over the past several months. I told him that helping his daughter wasn't about erasing what happened between us. It was about refusing to let his cruelty 7 years ago dictate who I chose to be now. Here's what I've learned, and what I hope you take with you from this story. The people who laugh at your collapse are rarely thinking about karma or justice. They're thinking about their own fear, dressed up as superiority, because watching someone else fall reminds them uncomfortably of how fragile their own security really is. You don't need to wish suffering on them. Life has its own timing, its own way of humbling people who need humbling. And you don't have to lift a finger to make that happen. What you can control is who you become in the space between your worst day and your best one. I could have let Marcus Whitfield's laughter define the rest of my life. I could have built my comeback around proving him wrong, around revenge, dressed up as ambition. Instead, I built it around becoming someone who understood suffering well enough to ease it in others. Even the suffering of people who once caused mine. Sophia is 17 now. And she's the one who encouraged me to finally tell this story publicly, on this very channel. She said other people needed to hear it. People who are exactly where I was 7 years ago, standing on a sidewalk with a cardboard box, listening to laughter they'll never forget. If that's you right now, I want you to hear this clearly. This is not the end of your story. It's the middle of it. The hardest, darkest middle. And there is a version of your life on the other side of this that you cannot yet imagine. One where the people who laughed at your lowest moment might one day need something. Only you can give them. What you choose to do in that moment will say more about who you've become than anything that happened to you 7 years earlier ever could. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone in the middle of their own hardest chapter who needs to know the ending isn't written yet. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if the people who laughed at your collapse showed up at your door years later asking for help? I want to hear your answer, because your stories, your resilience, your comebacks, they're exactly why this channel, Icy Whisper, exists. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about the quiet, unglamorous, unbreakable strength it takes to rebuild a life from nothing. Thank you for being here, for letting Legacy Whisper share this with you. And I'll see you in the next story.